Welcome back. It's time for what's fast becoming a tradition here, using the publicly available data to perform World of Warcraft's health checkup. This time around, things are actually quite funky given the unusual raid format of 9.2, but the numbers absolutely are interesting. Now, when we last left off in this, it had become apparent that 9.1 had a massive drop-off in players. That, of course, means that 9.2's job is to retain people and hopefully bring more players back. Numbers tend to decrease as expansions go on. They always have, there's just some attrition, so a flat line or even a minor decrease would be a win for 9.2. So, did it win? Well, it and you can win harder with squarespace.com/Bellular Gaming, today's sponsor, because they help you win in the web. They've ran two of our sites, one that's hired key staff, and of course most recently, our Game Studio site for the Pale Beyond. Now with their easy-to-use site builder and award-winning templates, they just make it so easy to do all this. I mean, we've even got things like a mailing list built in, which is just such a handy time saver. Now, we've got a reveal coming up in May, and for that, I've been working on a few private pages, and doing what I've needed to do has been so easy with their various different pre-made blocks. And soon enough, I'm actually going to have it hooked up to a fulfillment center so we can run our own merchandise. They seriously have e-commerce features down so well. It's a joy to use, and the large amounts of time that I save go straight back into making things, like the video you're watching right now. Squarespace is the fast and easy way to have a fantastic web presence, and having that is important. It's going to be people's first impression of you online, so you gotta make it count. And to do so, head to squarespace.com/Bellular Gaming with the code Bellular Gaming, and that will get you 10% off. So thank you, Squarespace, and let's dive into some of these Warcraft numbers. Raid time. Okay, first off, let's do normal mode and boss guild kills in the first 4 weeks of the tier. On the face of it, this looks horrid for 9.2, but you must remember that Zovaal was only available on week 4 of the patch, whereas Sylvanas and Denathrius were available from week 2. Well, the start of week 2. What we can do, though, is further dive into this data by comparing some first versus last boss kills and a few other things. So for Nathria and Sanctum, 61.44% of guilds cleared the last boss within the first 4 weeks of the patch, whereas only 26 did for Sepulchre. Taking a look at the other numbers, we see a 71% decrease in the number of guilds that defeated normal Jailer compared to normal Sylvanas within the first month. And that actually comes after a huge decrease of 50% in the number of guilds that defeated Sylvanas normal compared to Denathrius normal in that time period. Now, if reflective of the player base, this is a bloody disastrous trend. But we've got to dive into what produced these numbers, the structure of the raid and the incentives of the game. This number would always have been smaller because progress on Zovaal was delayed by a week because of the narrative decision to delay the last 3 bosses. That said, normal participation should be quite high this time around because loads of players are going into normal to get tier gear, which doesn't drop from Zovaal, further weakening the importance of this dataset. Indeed, week 5 of Shadowlands saw double legendaries. Of course, that also likely coincided, as it did with me, with more players getting their 2 or 4 piece of tier and a whole bunch of nerfs to normal mode. So as you can see, there's a lot going against Zovaal guild kills within the first 4 weeks of the patch. And perhaps even this dataset can inform us as to why Blizzard nerfed Zovaal, nerfed like the raid as heavy as they did, right? Maybe they saw these low numbers and thought, you know what, double Legos ain't enough, we need to nerf it a bit more. Maybe that's the case. Hell, I mean, while this wouldn't be a problem to heroic or mythic guilds, I think it is also true that Sepulchre was just tuned to be harder than normal Sanctum, and that would slow down normal mode guilds. Again, hence the nerfs. Now, what about the heroic numbers for this time period? Well, this is where we continue to see interesting data. Recently, the percentage of heroic guilds that get ahead of the curve within the first month has been decreasing. In Legion, that number was 28.82%, in BFA, 24.86%. So, getting a bit lower in BFA, but not a disaster. In Shadowlands, it's a mere 10.53%, with only 4% of heroic guilds managing to defeat Zovaal within the first 4 weeks. Now, if you remove Zovaal from the Shadowlands average and recalculate the number would actually be 13.72%. That is still just under half of the number of BFA. And that's just really low. I mean, if I think about this, you could say Stone Legion Generals was a bit of a roadblock boss, and, plenty of us did report, oh, Castle Lathria, this is a pretty fun raid, it's also kind of hard. For Sanctum, I mean, there was just general drop-off in players, and then, of course, there was the lawsuit. It's just interesting that those numbers are so much smaller for Shadowlands, even when you remove Zovaal, who is, of course, the more complicated number, given the surrounding factors. So I guess that means that tiers, be this for good or for ill, are lasting longer. Is that a good thing for Blizzard? Do players actually stick around for more months, or do they just not enjoy the curve of progress and drop off? On face value, Zovaal heroic kills being an 84% decline over Sylvanas heroic kills in the same time frame, that is scary in face value. But again, there are good reasons as to why only 359 guilds had defeated Heroic Jailer in this time frame. He was available a week later. So if you compared Zovaal week 4 to Sylvanas week 3, i.e. when they had been out for the same amount of time, you would have 1,195 guilds clearing Sylvanas and 359 clearing Zovaal. So that still is a large decrease, and that kind of looks bad. But let's compare a bit to Mythic so we can actually understand this number. 302 guilds cleared Mythic Pantheon. 707 Mythic Sausage, whatever. 586 for Mythic Zymox. These Mythic kill counts are, in many cases around or higher than Heroic Zovaal. Weird, but is this a one-off? Well, yes and no. In Sanctum, in this time frame, more guilds had cleared the first 3 Mythic bosses than had killed Heroic Sylvanas. So this is not a new trend. The difference is that this time, 5 Mythic bosses have more kills than the end boss, up from 3. Now this somewhat makes sense, given a whole bunch of factors, so let's just summarize those factors. Zovaal does not drop tier. Heroic end bosses often feel like early Mythic bosses, but drop lower item level loot. Early Mythic kills give you a better chance at tier from the Great Vault at a high item level than just getting Zovaal and Heroic. Also, Zovaal wasn't really doable by many Heroic guilds within the first few weeks because they didn't have tier sets and they didn't have double legendaries, which for most people that fight is tuned around, or proportionately, they hadn't spent as many days raiding as those Mythic guilds who could be raiding, 3, 4, 5, 6 nights a week even if they're really pushing it. So can we learn much else from these numbers? Well, here's the first boss and last boss kills for the first 4 weeks of every raid since the Emerald Nightmare. The first boss difference is massive, from 4,941 in Sanctum to 1,404 in Sepulchre. Ouch. And the last boss kills are kind of hilarious, from 62 in Sanctum to a mere 2. Of course, that's Echo and Method. So, numbers down? Game dead? Not really. Many Mythic guilds were waiting to get their players 2 and 4 sets before actually starting Mythic progression. And that led to a lot of these Mythic guilds, and as an example, the prime researcher of this, or the researcher of this video, Dakor, is a Mythic cutting edge raider, right? So that involves clearing Mythic, within the tier. So he's in a guild practicing all of this. And for these guilds, what they were doing is they were clearing LFR, they were clearing normal, and they were clearing heroic. And they were doing lots of Mythic Plus to maximally fill their vault with as many, high item level slots as possible in order to get some tier. I mean, hell, like 1 or 2 of my tier pieces come from Mythic Plus Great Vault. I think it's 1. Anyway, it's still important. Some people even had it into PvP. So for a lot of these guilds, because they're not pushing for world firsts or anything crazy like that, they're going to invest their time into the things that will get their players 2-piece and 4-piece before they invest time in actually trying to clear a Mythic. Because for most, Mythic is tuned to be doable with double legendaries and tier. And that just is going to reduce participation within the early weeks. So, when will these numbers go up? What are the things to watch out for? I mean, I think the first one is obviously the creation catalyst. That's going to help the unlucky people get their 2-piece, and the decently lucky, like myself, to get our 4-pieces. That unlocks April 12th, a full 8 weeks in, and I think many people do consider that to be quite late. So what's my takeaway from this, from looking at this raid data? Well, I think numbers are probably a bit down overall. That is to be expected. And personally, I think that's a mix of the various different reasons we've laid out thus far. And I think very likely a decent enough chunk of players dropping off. This patch was announced with some mild ridicule, many people seeing it as further proof that the team had jumped shark, and there was a few PTR dramas over, player power and reputation. I'm sure those things didn't help. But I do say that as being somebody who, for what it is, has actually enjoyed the patch quite a bit. Okay, so I promised you week 3 comparisons. Essentially with the idea of Anduin being the end boss, and then sort of comparing him to the other tiers. After all, Blizzard themselves said that Anduin, in any other circumstance, could actually be an end boss. So let's check it out. For this analysis, we have taken all past tiers to the first 3-week end boss kills, taking into account, of course, how the last 3 bosses of 9.2 were not available immediately. So less time, but you could say potentially a sort of fair comparison. Anduin drops tier, which certainly will have motivated people to kill him. Okay, so normal mode first, starting with Zoval's first week. Right, Denathrius, 19,021 kills. Sylvanas, 9,477. Zoval, 3,277. 65% drop. So, are less people playing? Was it too hard? Was the loot worth it? Well, let's add Anduin into this mix. 8,851 guilds defeated Anduin. That's only a 6% decrease on the number, the 9,447, that defeated Sylvanas and Sanctum. But of course it is still a large enough decrease from Sire, who was defeated by that 19,000 odd guilds. And this actually looks to be more in line with what I would expect. I mean, dare I say, it even looks pretty healthy. I mean, let's compare this tier-to-tier drop-off for BFA. It had 17,854 defeating Cahoon. That decreases 45.7% for Jaina, with only 9,692 defeating her. Shara dropped off a further 14.55%, and Pearl N'Zoth from that baseline dropped a larger 50.93%. That's a normal, but before I turn on analysis mode, let's have a think about heroic mode. It's another alarming statistic on the face of it. Zoval is down 69.96% from Sylvanas. But before signing the death certificate, let's remember again that the later bosses are tuned for 2-4 set and double Legos, and likely sort of fewer guilds will have came back in general. There are less incentives to kill Zoval because he doesn't drop tier. But the number is still interesting because this is covering 3 weeks of Zoval availability versus 3 weeks of prior end boss availability. Bringing Anduin into the picture, things once again make more sense though, because he had 2,567 kills, which is up 115% from Sylvanas' 1,195 kills. This increase is a lot larger than the minus 6.31% decrease that we saw between Sylvanas normal and Anduin normal. Kind of impressive. Well, remember, Blizzard did sort of try to nuke Anduin a bit with nerfs in the first week or two, but still, Anduin should be an easier boss than Sylvanas. He was not tuned as an end boss, even if his mechanics would have supported him being an end boss. He is boss 9 of this raid, unlike Sylvanas, who is boss 10 of her raid, and the same goes for Denathrius. So overall, it's an interesting data set. I think we shouldn't go apples to apples, Anduin versus Sylvanas. We definitely shouldn't do that. I think Anduin should be higher than Sylvanas, because he is a, very slightly an earlier boss, and, some nerfs and stuff. But this does point to the overall raid population, not like calamitously falling off or anything like that. Okay, let's take a quick look at Mythic Plus and PvP then. Mplus is honestly a bit tricky because of our data sources. Week 1 and 2, data from Best Keystone just doesn't seem to be there, and the week 3 and 4 data is actually different to what Raider.io has reported. Now, If we were to assume that this is because of a difference in methodology, and that methodology has been consistent, then we could compare the best keystone numbers for week 3 and 4 to prior seasons. And doing so is interesting enough, where Season 3 Week 3 had 518,000 runs, while Season 2 Week 3 had 635,000, and Season 1 Week 3 had 775,000 runs. So an overall downtrend, but not a humongously calamitous one. The Week 4 trend is similar. 503k runs for Season 3, 606k runs for Season 2, and 533k for Season 1. Season 1's a bit weird, it got off to a low start, but its numbers eventually went pretty high. Overall, it very much seems like the rate of Shadowlands losses has decreased. When you look at these Mplus numbers, assuming it's the same methodology and the data's not corrupted, which I think could kind of line up with what that normal and heroic Anduin number that I just covered told us. I think it does make sense. 9.2 is a better patch than 9.1 in almost every way, and the endgame certainly feels better than it did in Season 1 or Season 2. I think 9.2 probably felt novel enough, and it had enough positive changes to help to stem the tide. And while not a patch 5.2 style reversal in fortunes with player counts overall going up, I think, we can maybe see that 9.2 has clearly retained players better. I'm not going to say great, but better, and I think that does show us that World of Warcraft needs generally more accessibility stuff in the endgame, and it needs novel, new content that's not brown-grey sludge. Zereth Mortis is that. Sepulchre is a great raid. Of course, yes, in spite of some qualms over raid loot and tier accessibility. If we look at the PvP numbers, it's kind of simple enough, really. There's not been a large increase, but there's also not been a large decrease. So let's try to wrap this up. Well, we've learned quite a lot here, mostly about raid tuning, structure, pacing, and loot systems, and basically how those interact to change numbers. 9.2 just had a different format to 9.1 and 9.0, and that makes comparisons hard. Now, numbers do seem like they may be down extremely in a few of these comparisons, but I think that can significantly be explained by all the things we've talked about in today's video, and those normal and heroic mode Anduin numbers are certainly rather interesting. I think the question really is that with lower initial kill counts, will we instead see players progress over a longer period of time, leading to pretty good retention for this patch? Well, that is something that we want to test in the future, and it's why we've done this video now, because we're kind of, placing a stake in it, highlighting the interesting situation with these numbers, and we can in the future compare back to this. Which does mean that some things are just hard to say at this stage. I mean, look, patch 9.1, I think anecdotally we can at least all agree that it was significantly more frustrating than 9.2. So I think there's no wonder that people will have left at a pretty rapid rate in 9.1. Plus, obviously, the Blizzard controversy, which, I mean, at least for my guild, we just didn't feel like playing the game around that time, and I know it's the same for many other guilds. I think then what 9.2 represents is an imperfect patch that appears to be an earnest attempt to do better, even though it does have some stumbles. Zereth Mortis, while I think a little bit tired in its macro design, it is an excellent zone, especially compared to Korthia, which was pretty much horrible. Sepulchre is a great raid. In my guild, we've all enjoyed it a lot more than Sanctum, and I've heard similar sentiment in other places. Picking up the game again was far easier this time. I mean, I swapped from Hunter to Mage just before this patch, and between this patch's things of the rapid renown catch-up through doing the new campaign and, the previous things from 9.1.5, just getting in and playing the game was way more accessible. Now, if I wanted to change away from the Kyrian Covenant on my Frost Mage, which I know I should prefer to, for performance, I would be very frustrated at how the Covenant system still works. But I suppose that means that for somebody who's deciding to play the game casually right now because I just don't want to get deep into it, maybe it shows that these systems, the changes have been pretty good. I mean, they've certainly meant that I can play the game. Because with the way that it was, there's no way I'd be playing the game. I haven't really been enjoying Hunter that much, and if I wasn't convinced that I could get a fresh mage up to speed in a reasonable amount of time, I simply would not have came back. So a lot of those changes are directly responsible for me playing the game right now. I'm sure they are for plenty of you as well. I mean, as an example, Matt was getting super tired on Holy Paladin. He was able to go, I think, Shaman and then Druid. All in decent enough time, actually, because of this patch. It didn't feel super horrible. I mean, there's a few things that felt bad, but, you know, it wasn't like a big, calamitous, horrible grindfest like it could have been in the past. But I think for many players, the damage is done, and it will be the job of 10.0 to convince them that the game is on a better track. I cannot blame anyone for leaving, not at all. I mean, we all just stopped playing WoW mid-heroic progression and essentially did not touch the game until March the following year. That was my whole guild. We were all gone and not playing the game. I'm sure it was like that for many of your guilds as well. So there you go. That's the word in 9.2. I think it's done a pretty decent job. To see, ultimately, we're just going to have to check in, because this is a raid tier that has been spread out over a longer period of time, and the creation catalyst is coming in strangely late. I'm sure many people will be playing another game, FF14, on April 12th, instead of being excited for the creation catalyst, which is a bit of an L for Blizzard. But hey, it is what it is. We'll just have to see the numbers whenever player data actually creates them. Of course, then, to get yourself a kick-ass web presence, save yourself a whole bunch of time, stress, and hassle, and help us out, you can go to squarespace.com/Bellular Gaming. A big thanks to them for sponsoring today's video, and I believe actually sponsoring this entire series of WoW health checkups, which is pretty awesome of them. So, their links down below. Thank you very much for watching today's video, and with that, I'll see you next time.